Welcome to this journey through one of the darkest chapters of medieval European craftsmanship, where the line between artisan and executioner became horrifyingly blurred. Tell us where you're watching from now, because this story will challenge everything you thought you knew about the nature of evil in a way few other accounts can. We're about to delve into a mystery that haunted the Rhine Valley for over 2 decades, where a single craftsman defied all codes of moral conduct and left a legacy so disturbing that church records deliberately obscured his name, referring to him only as the Devil's Hammer. His creations traveled across kingdoms, his reputation spread like plague, and his workshop became synonymous with suffering itself. It was the year 1476. The printing press had recently revolutionized Europe, spreading ideas and information at unprecedented speeds. The Renaissance was flowering in Italy, painting cathedrals with light and beauty. But in the Germanic territories along the Rhine, in the patchwork of principalities and free cities that would not become unified Germany for another 4 centuries, the situation was considerably darker. This was the age of the witch trials, though the worst was yet to come. The Malleus Maleficarum, that infamous guide to witch hunting, would be published just 8 years later. Torture was not merely legal. It was considered essential to justice, a sacred tool for extracting truth from the lips of the accused. The Catholic Church sanctioned it, civil authorities required it, and someone had to make the instruments. Enter Hans Schmidt. The name itself was common as John Smith in English. Perhaps that's why he chose it, or perhaps it was truly his given name. Historical records from the free imperial city of Strasbourg list him in the guild registries of 1473 as simply Schmidt H. Blacksmith, Cruten au Quarter. Nothing remarkable. Nothing alarming, but Hans Schmidt was not an ordinary blacksmith. While his neighbors forged horseshoes and plowshares, hinges and hammers, Schmidt was creating something else entirely in the depths of his workshop. While other craftsmen took pride in their church railings and decorative ironwork, Schmidt was perfecting mechanisms designed for a single purpose: the systematic destruction of the human body. And he was very, very good at it. Strasbourg in the late 1500s was a city of contrasts, a prosperous trading center where wealth flowed through the fingers of merchants like the Rhine itself, where cathedral spires pierced the sky and cobblestone streets wound through timber, framed houses that leaned toward each other as if sharing secrets. The great cathedral, its single spire soaring over the cityscape, was still under construction, a testament to ambition and faith. But prosperity brings its own darkness. With wealth comes crime, with commerce comes conflict, with freedom comes the fear of chaos. The Krutenau Quarter lay on the southeastern edge of the walled city, where the Ill River branched and created small islands of land. Here, the craftsmen and laborers made their homes, tanners who worked leather in pungent workshops, butchers whose shops ran red with blood, dyers who stained the water with their pigments, and blacksmiths whose forges glowed like the fires of perdition itself. Schmidt's workshop stood at the end of Schwarz Gas Black Alley, so named for the perpetual soot that coated its buildings. The structure was unremarkable: half-timbered walls, a slate roof, shuttered windows that were always closed. But those who passed by noticed something: the sounds. Most smithies rang with a familiar rhythm, the steady strike of hammer on anvil, the hiss of hot metal meeting water, the rasp of file on iron. Working metal has its own music, predictable and almost comforting in its repetition. But from Schmidt's forge came different sounds: irregular striking, the screech of metal against metal, testing sounds, springs released, mechanisms clicked, joints articulated. And sometimes, late at night, when the city watch made their rounds, they heard other sounds, whimpering, Whether from Schmidt testing his creations on animals, as he later claimed, or something worse, no one could say for certain. Hans Schmidt was, by all contemporary accounts, unremarkable in appearance, medium height, perhaps 40 years of age, with the broad shoulders and scarred hands common to his profession. His face was described in a single surviving testimony as neither handsome nor hideous, but possessed of eyes that did not meet one's gaze directly. He had arrived in Strasbourg sometime in 1472, presenting himself to the Blacksmiths' Guild with letters of recommendation from workshops in Nuremberg. The letters were convincing. The guild accepted him. He paid his fees, swore his oaths, and established his business. For the first year, he seemed to operate normally. Household items, tools, repairs. The guild inspectors who examined his work found it competent, not masterful, but adequate. He kept to himself, hired no apprentices, married no local woman, attended church irregularly, but not suspiciously so. But then came his first commission, the one that would change everything. In the spring of 1474, a messenger arrived at Schmidt's workshop, bearing the seal of the Strasbourg Criminal Court. The magistrates had a requirement. They needed new instruments for the examination chamber, the euphemistic term for the torture room beneath the city hall where accused criminals were questioned. The city's previous supplier had died the winter before, and his son refused to continue the family business. "I will not forge the devil's tools," he had declared publicly, choosing instead to apprentice as a cooper. The magistrates were irritated but pragmatic. They needed a new craftsman. They had heard that Schmidt was skilled with mechanisms. They had heard he worked discreetly. They had heard he asked no questions. All three rumors were true. According to the account books preserved in the Strasbourg archives, Schmidt accepted the commission without hesitation. The order was specific: 1 set of thumbscrews, 1 set of leg vises, a new rack mechanism to replace the aging wooden structure currently in use, and a branching iron, the device used to brand convicted criminals with marks denoting their crimes. The payment was generous, 40 guilders, roughly equivalent to 6 months' income for a typical craftsman. Schmidt delivered the items within 8 weeks. The magistrates were impressed. The thumbscrews featured a screw mechanism of such precision that pressure could be applied in minute increments, allowing interrogators unprecedented control. The leg vises were lined with small spikes that could be adjusted to determine the severity of pain. The rack's mechanism featured brass gears that turned smoothly, silently, each rotation calculated to stretch the victim's body exactly 2 inches before requiring reset. And the branding iron, it featured an innovative design, a hollow handle that could be filled with coals, keeping the branding end consistently hot for hours without requiring return to the forge. The magistrates paid him immediately. They also gave him another commission, and then another. Word spread. Within a year, Schmidt was receiving orders from beyond Strasbourg. The court of the Archbishop of Mainz requested a set of Iron Maidens, those legendary coffins lined with spikes, though whether they were ever actually used or merely served as psychological torture tools remains debated by historians. The Free City of Frankfurt wanted a new strappado mechanism for their interrogation rooms. The Duke of Württemberg commissioned an entire suite of instruments for his castle's dungeon. Schmidt's prices were high, but his work was exceptional. He approached torture device creation with the same methodical precision that a clockmaker brought to his gears or a locksmith to his tumblers. Every mechanism was tested, every measurement was exact, every device was designed to inflict maximum suffering while keeping the victim alive and conscious for as long as possible. Because that was the point. Quick death was not the goal, confession was, information was. And pain was the currency of truth, or at least the coerced admission of whatever truth the interrogators wanted to hear. Schmidt maintained detailed notebooks, preserved by chance when his workshop was eventually seized. These leather-bound volumes contained sketches, measurements, notes on human anatomy, observations about stress points and pain tolerance. One entry, dated September 14, 1476, reads in stark medieval German, "The knee joint, when compressed between iron plates with slow and steady pressure, produces screaming that can be heard through stone walls. The subject remains conscious and capable of speech even as the joint is destroyed. Profit on these devices, 300%. Profit." That single word appears repeatedly throughout his notes. Schmidt saw his work purely as business. He showed no evidence of sadism, no indication that he derived pleasure from suffering. He was simply a craftsman who had identified a lucrative niche and pursued it with entrepreneurial enthusiasm, which somehow makes it worse. A sadist can be understood, condemned, even pitied. But a man who inflicts suffering for simple profit, who calculates pain in terms of guilders and accounts receivable, who treats human agony as just another commodity, that requires a different kind of moral emptiness. Few people ever entered Schmidt's workshop uninvited. Those who did described it in testimony given much later, their words preserved in trial records. The main room contained a forge larger than typical for household work, capable of reaching the intense temperatures needed for specialized metalwork. An anvil stood nearby, its surface scored with thousands of hammer strikes. Tools hung from the walls in organized rows, hammers of varying weights, tongs, files, chisels, measuring calipers of remarkable precision. But it was the back room that revealed the true nature of Schmidt's business. Here, finished devices awaited delivery, arranged on wooden shelves like merchandise in a shop. Thumbscrews in graduated sizes, tongue-terrors instruments designed to grip and remove tongues, pear-shaped devices that could be inserted into bodily orifices and then expanded via a screw mechanism, iron boots that could be heated while worn, breaking wheels, both the wagon, wheel variety used for public execution, and the smaller hand-turned mechanisms used in questioning chambers. One witness, a city inspector named Friedrich Halsmann, who entered the workshop in 1480, for on an unrelated guild matter, later testified, "I felt I had descended into hell itself." Devices were arranged with such order, such cleanliness, such care. Each was labeled with a small wooden tag noting its purpose and price. He spoke of them as a merchant speaks of fabric or spices. "This model is popular with the ecclesiastical courts," he told me, holding up a device whose purpose I dare not describe even now. Good value, very durable. Schmidt also maintained a fitting room of sorts, a small chamber where devices could be tested for size and function. The walls were stone, the floor slightly sloped toward a central drain. Iron rings were bolted to the walls at various heights. Whether this room was used only for mechanical testing or served darker purposes became a point of grim speculation. In the autumn of 1481, a young apprentice named Caspar Müller vanished from Strasbourg streets. Caspar was 16, the son of a wool merchant, and had recently been apprenticed to a local cooper. He was described as diligent but curious, the type of boy who asked too many questions and wandered places he shouldn't. On the evening of October 23rd, he left his master's workshop at dusk, intending to return to his family's home in the Petite France quarter. He never arrived. His disappearance caused concern but not alarm. Young men sometimes ran away, joining mercenary companies or seeking fortune elsewhere. The city watch made inquiries. Nothing was found. After a month, most people stopped talking about it. Then came the second disappearance. Maria Kessler, a 19-year-old serving girl who worked in one of the taverns near Schwarzgasse, failed to return home after her shift on January 9, 1482. Her family reported her missing immediately. The City Watch searched more thoroughly this time, questioning tavern patrons and combing the riverside areas where violence sometimes occurred. Again, nothing. By 1483, 5 people had vanished from the Cruta, now quarter, and its surroundings. All were young, between 15 and 25. All were from working families, people without the influence to demand extensive investigations. All had last been seen in the evening hours, in the vicinity of Schwarzgasse. The city's authorities began to take notice. But connecting disappearances to solutions was another matter entirely. Medieval law enforcement was primitive by modern standards. There were no detectives, no forensic methods, no systematic investigation techniques. The City Watch was essentially a patrol force, responsible for maintaining order and apprehending obvious criminals. Missing persons, unless there was clear evidence of foul play, a body, a witness, signs of struggle, there was little they could do. While young people vanished from his neighborhood, Schmidt's business flourished. His reputation as the finest creator of interrogation instruments in the German-speaking lands was now well established. Orders came from as far as Prague and Vienna. He employed no assistants, maintained his solitary ways, but his workshop's output was remarkably prolific. How did he manage such productivity? Some whispered about dark pacts. Others suggested he had found a method of mass production. The truth, as later became clear, was more disturbing than either speculation. He was practicing. Schmidt's devices were refined through iteration, through testing, through the methodical application of scientific principles to the infliction of pain. But such refinement required subjects, animals, he claimed later, but the evidence suggested otherwise. One person in Strasbourg was paying attention to the pattern Father Wilhelm Drescher, a Franciscan friar who ministered to the poor of the Krutenau quarter. Father Wilhelm kept meticulous records of his parish, noting births, deaths, marriages, and those who disappeared without explanation. In his personal journal, preserved in the Strasbourg diocesan archives, he began noting something disturbing in late 1482. 5 souls vanished in as many seasons. He wrote on December 30th, young people, all from the poorest families, all last seen near the forge of the blacksmith Schmidt. I have brought my concerns to the city magistrates, but they say evidence is required. What evidence do the missing leave behind? Their absence itself is the evidence. Father Wilhelm took it upon himself to observe Schmidt more closely. He began walking past the workshop at different times, noting who came and went, listening to the sounds that emerged from within. What he discovered troubled him deeply. Schmidt received visitors late at night, figures in hooded cloaks, who arrived via the back alleys, entering through a rear door that opened onto the riverbank. These meetings were brief, and the visitors always left carrying large bundles wrapped in cloth, more devices being delivered. Perhaps, but Father Wilhelm noticed something else. Sometimes the bundles moved. He also noticed that beggars and street children, who typically clustered around workshops hoping for scraps or small work opportunities, avoided Schwarzgasse entirely. Animals, too. The feral cats that prowled Strasbourg's alleys in their dozens never lingered near Schmidt's door. On March 15, 1483, Father Wilhelm approached Schmidt directly, knocking on the workshop door in broad daylight. According to his journal, the conversation was brief and deeply unsettling. I asked him plainly if he knew anything of the disappearances. Father Wilhelm wrote. He looked at me with those dead eyes and said, "Father, I am a craftsman who fulfills legal commissions for lawful authorities. The Church itself employs my work in the examination of heretics. If you have accusations, present them to the magistrates. If not, I ask that you cease spreading slanders that harm my business." His words were correct, his tone respectful, yet I left that encounter feeling as though I had touched something cold and hollow, something that wore the shape of a man, but contained nothing human within. In June of 1483, a woman named Greta Schmidt, no relation to Hans, the surname being common, arrived at Father Wilhelm's church asking for help. She was a widow, approximately 35 years old, who had been hired by Hans Schmidt 3 months earlier to clean his workshop once per week. What she told Father Wilhelm sent him immediately to the city magistrates. Greta had been instructed to clean only the main workshop area, never the back room. Schmidt was always present during her work, watching her from his position at the forge. She was paid well, better than any cleaning work she'd done before, but the job filled her with dread. The smell, she told Father Wilhelm, her words recorded in his journal. It wasn't just forge smoke and metal. There was something underneath it, something sweet and rotten, and the drain in the back room, Father, when I swept near the door, just the threshold, never inside as he'd forbidden. I saw stains on the floor, brown stains that water hadn't washed away. She continued, "One day I arrived earlier than expected. The door was ajar. I heard sounds from the back room, not the sounds of metalwork, crying, weak, hopeless crying, like an animal in a trap. And then Schmidt's voice, calm as could be, saying, 'Stop that. You're making it difficult to take proper measurements.' Greta had fled and never returned, even foregoing her pay. She had said nothing for 3 months, terrified that Schmidt would discover she'd overheard. But her conscience finally overwhelmed her fear. Father Wilhelm brought her testimony to the magistrates. This time they listened. The investigation of Hans Schmidt officially commenced on July 2, 1483, under the authority of Magistrate Heinrich Brandt, a man known for his stern enforcement of law and, ironically, his enthusiastic use of the very interrogation techniques that Schmidt's devices facilitated. Magistrate Brandt was no reformer. He did not question the morality of torture, but he was rigorous about legal procedure and unsanctioned torture, if that's what was occurring in Schmidt's workshop, was a serious crime. The city held a monopoly on legal violence. A craftsman conducting his own experiments would face severe punishment. The investigation proceeded slowly. Schmidt was a legal businessman with powerful clients. The Archbishop's court had recently placed another large order. The Duke of Württemberg had specifically requested that Schmidt personally deliver a custom device to his castle. Moving against him required careful preparation. Magistrate Brandt began by interviewing Schmidt's neighbors. Most were reluctant to speak. Those who did offered only vague concerns: the strange sounds, the late, night visitors, the way Schmidt never attended festivals or guild gatherings, remaining always solitary and watchful. Next, Brandt examined the guild records and tax documents. Schmidt's income was substantial and properly documented. He paid his taxes, met his guild obligations, contributed to the city's coffers. Everything appeared legitimate. But then Brandt made a connection that would prove crucial. He compared the dates of Schmidt's major commissions with the dates of the disappearances. A pattern emerged. After each large order, particularly those requiring multiple devices or experimental designs, a disappearance occurred within 2 to 4 weeks. It could have been coincidence. Brandt didn't believe in coincidence. On the night of August 17, 1483, Magistrate Brandt, accompanied by Father Wilhelm and 6 armed members of the city watch, concealed themselves in an abandoned tannery across from Schmidt's workshop. They waited for hours. The summer darkness fell late, and mosquitoes from the nearby river tormented them, but they remained silent and still. At approximately 11 o'clock by the cathedral bells, a figure approached Schmidt's rear door, hooded, moving quickly, carrying something over one shoulder. The figure knocked 3 times, paused, knocked twice more. The door opened, spilling yellow lamplight across the alley. Schmidt appeared, gesturing the figure inside. The door closed. 20 minutes later, the figure emerged, no longer carrying their burden, received a small pouch from Schmidt payment, presumably, and hurried away into the darkness. Magistrate Brandt made a decision. They would wait until Schmidt retired for the night, then conduct an official inspection of the premises under the authority of the city magistracy. He had a warrant prepared in advance, signed by the Burgermeister himself. At 2 o'clock in the morning, they approached the workshop door. What they found inside would become the subject of horrified whispers for generations. The main workshop revealed nothing immediately suspicious. Tools, forge, works in progress, all appropriate for a blacksmith, but the locked door to the back room required forcing. Schmidt, awakened by the commotion, attempted to stop them, claiming that the magistrate had no authority to damage his property without cause. Magistrate Brandt ignored him. 2 guards broke down the door with a battering ram. The smell hit them first. Despite the ventilation, despite the drain, the back room reeked of blood, excrement, and decay. The guards' lanterns revealed a scene from Nightmare. The interrogation devices Schmidt had claimed to test on animals had indeed been tested on living subjects. But not animals. Chained to the wall was a young man, barely conscious, his body marked with burns, cuts, and the distinctive injuries caused by various compression devices. He was alive, but just barely. In the corner, covered by a tarp, they found 2 bodies in various stages of decomposition. Both appeared to be adolescents. Schmidt's testing notebooks lay open on a workbench, their pages filled with detailed observations. Subject endured the thumbscrews for 17 minutes before losing consciousness. Read one entry dated July 3, 1483. Revived with cold water, continued testing with the pair. Results exceeded expectations for durability of device. Subject expired after 43 minutes. Total testing time, approximately 2 hours. Devices performed admirably. The entries were clinical, detached, utterly devoid of any recognition that the subjects were human beings. Hans Schmidt did not resist arrest. He did not attempt to flee. He stood calmly as the guards shackled him, his expression showing what witnesses described as mild annoyance, as if he'd been interrupted during an important task. "I am a legally licensed craftsman," he said clearly. "Everything I have done has been in service of lawful authorities. My work has been purchased by courts, by the church, by nobles across the empire. I have committed no crime." Magistrate Brandt, a man who had overseen countless interrogations and executions without visible emotion, later wrote in his official report that Schmidt's calm rationalization made him feel, though I gazed upon something that had never possessed a human soul. The young man chained to the wall was identified as Peter Halser, a 17-year-old apprentice tailor who had vanished 6 days earlier. He survived long enough to give testimony before dying of his injuries 3 days after his rescue. His account, though fragmented by trauma and pain, confirmed that Schmidt had lured him to the workshop with an offer of paid work, then drugged him with wine laced with laudanum. Peter described waking in the back room, already chained. He described Schmidt explaining, in a perfectly conversational tone, that he would be helping test some new devices for an important commission. He described pain beyond description, and he described Schmidt taking notes throughout, occasionally adjusting a mechanism, measuring the results, muttering calculations. He was never angry, Peter testified, his voice barely a whisper. He never shouted or seemed excited. He worked on me the way a carpenter works on wood. I was just material to him. The two bodies found in the workshop were identified as Caspar Müller, the cooper's apprentice who had vanished in 1481, and Maria Kessler, the serving girl. How many others there had been, disposed of in the Rhine or buried in unknown locations, would never be fully determined. The trial of Hans Schmidt commenced on September 25, 1483, in the Great Hall of Strasbourg's City Council building. The proceedings drew enormous crowds. Every seat was filled, and hundreds more gathered in the square outside, waiting for news. The tribunal consisted of 5 magistrates, with Heinrich Brandt serving as chief prosecutor. Schmidt was appointed a defense advocate, as was legally required, though the man chosen for this unenviable task, a lawyer named Georg Wenzel, would later write that it was the most disturbing case of his career. Schmidt faced multiple charges: murder, kidnapping, torture outside legal authority, and, most seriously, heresy. The Church had become involved because Schmidt's notebooks contained observations suggesting he had deliberately prolonged suffering for experimental purposes rather than extracting confessions, thus perverting the sacred purpose of examination. The trial lasted 6 days. On the first day, the prosecution presented physical evidence: the devices found in Schmidt's workshop, his notebooks, the bodies of the victims. The magistrates passed the notebooks among themselves, their faces growing progressively more ashen as they read the clinical descriptions of human suffering. One magistrate, Johann Fischer, demanded to know, "Did you feel nothing, no remorse, no hesitation?" Schmidt's response, recorded by court scribes, exemplified the hollowness at his core. "Your Honor, when a carpenter builds a table, does he feel remorse for the wood? When a butcher slaughters a pig, does he hesitate? I am a craftsman. These subjects were necessary for perfecting my work. My clients demand excellence. Excellence requires testing. I provided what the market demanded." The courtroom erupted in shouts. Guards had to restore order. Peter Halser testified on the second day, carried into the courtroom on a litter. His wounds were still visible, his body broken by the devices that Schmidt had tested on him. His testimony was halting, interrupted by pain and memory, but its impact was devastating. "I begged him to stop," Peter said, tears streaming down his face. "I told him I would do anything, say anything he wanted. He just shook his head and said, 'This isn't about confession, boy. I need to see how the joints hold under sustained pressure.' Then he made another notation in his book and turned the screw tighter. Several women in the audience wept openly. Even the magistrates, hardened by years of administering harsh justice, appeared shaken. The prosecution then called Father Wilhelm, who testified about the pattern of disappearances, about Greta Schmidt's observations, about his growing suspicion that something demonic was occurring in Schwarzgas. I use the word demonic deliberately. Father Wilhelm said, his voice carrying through the hall, "Not because I believe Hans Schmidt was possessed by demons, but because his actions demonstrate a profound absence, an absence of compassion, of conscience, of any spark of divinity. He is a void in human form, and his crimes are all the more terrible because they were committed not in passion or madness, but in cold, calculated pursuit of profit." Georg Wenzel, Schmidt's defense advocate, faced an impossible situation. His client was clearly guilty. The evidence was overwhelming. But legal procedure required a defense, and Wenzel attempted to construct one based on a novel argument. He argued that Schmidt had indeed committed terrible acts, but that these acts were fundamentally no different from what occurred in every official torture chamber across Europe. The only difference was authorization. Schmidt had created instruments of torture for legal authorities. Was it not logical that testing would be required? Did the magistrates themselves not ensure their scales were properly balanced before using them to weigh justice? If my client is guilty of torture, Wenzel argued, then so is every interrogator who has ever turned the screw on the rack. If he is guilty of causing suffering in pursuit of truth, then so is every court in Christendom. The only crime here is one of jurisdiction, that he conducted testing without official sanction. And for this administrative violation, you propose to execute him. It was, in its own way, a devastating argument, not because it would acquit Schmidt, but because it forced the court to confront an uncomfortable truth. The devices Schmidt created were used daily in the service of justice. The pain he inflicted experimentally was inflicted legally in courtrooms across the continent. The difference, as Magistrate Brandt pointed out in his rebuttal, was purpose. Legal torture served confession, served truth, however misguided that belief might seem to later generations. Schmidt's torture served only his commercial interests. He had commodified suffering, treated human beings as disposable materials in his workshop. There is a difference, Brandt argued, between the surgeon who cuts flesh to heal and the butcher who cuts flesh for profit. Both use sharp instruments, both cause pain, but intent defines morality. Hans Schmidt's intent was purely financial. He measured human agony in guilders and calculated pain in terms of product durability. He is not a torturer, he is worse. He is a merchant who sells suffering itself. On October 1st, 1483, after deliberating for 7 hours, the tribunal returned with their verdict. Guilty on all counts. The magistrates condemned Schmidt with unusual severity. The sentence was death by breaking wheel, the very same public execution method that Schmidt himself had improved through his innovative designs. The irony was not lost on anyone present. But before execution, Schmidt would himself be subjected to interrogation using the devices he had created. The Church insisted on this, seeking a confession of heresy and a statement of remorse. The civil authorities agreed, seeing it as appropriate justice. Schmidt received the news without visible emotion. When asked if he had any statement, he said simply, "My work will outlive me. The devices I created will continue to be used. In that sense, I am immortal." The courtroom fell silent. There was nothing to say to such darkness. On October 7th, 1483, Hans Schmidt was taken to the interrogation chamber beneath the city hall, the same chamber that housed many of his own creations. The proceedings were conducted by a specialized interrogator, overseen by Magistrate Brandt and Father Wilhelm. The goal was confession of heresy and expression of remorse for his crimes. The method was application of the very instruments Schmidt had designed. Contemporary records, though detailed about legal proceedings, are less specific about the interrogation itself. This was typical. Interrogations were considered necessary but distasteful, not matters for public discourse. However, Father Wilhelm's personal journal contains a brief entry dated October 7th that provides some insight. "Today I witnessed the interrogation of Hans Schmidt." He wrote, "I attended hoping to see repentance, to witness the breaking of his terrible pride, to hear him acknowledge the enormity of his sins. Instead, I saw something far more disturbing. Even as his own devices were applied to him, even as he experienced the pain he had so clinically inflicted on others, his responses were analytical. That mechanism could be improved, he said at one point, his voice tight with agony. The gearing creates uneven pressure. The interrogator, horrified, ceased his work. We had broken his body but could not reach his soul, for I am not certain he possessed one. Schmidt provided a confession of sorts, though whether genuine or simply a means to end the pain remains debatable. He admitted to murdering at least 7 young people, though he claimed there were more whose names he had not bothered to record. He confessed to heresy in the eyes of the Church, acknowledging that his use of torture for experimental purposes profaned the sacred process of seeking truth. But he never expressed remorse. Even in his signed confession, he wrote, "I regret the legal complications my methods have caused. I regret nothing else." October 12, 1483, dawned cold and gray over Strasbourg. Autumn fog rolled off the Rhine, shrouding the city in damp mist. The execution was scheduled for mid-morning, allowing time for crowds to gather. The execution site was the Rossmarkt, a large square used for markets and public gatherings. A wooden platform had been erected in the center, upon it a breaking wheel, one of Schmidt's own designs, commissioned years earlier by the city. Thousands attended. Executions were public events, considered both justice and education. The crowd was somber rather than celebratory. This was not entertainment but reckoning. At 10 o'clock by the cathedral bells, Schmidt was led from the city jail to the platform. He was shackled but not otherwise restrained. He walked steadily, his face expressionless. He had been dressed in a simple gray shift, the traditional garment of the condemned. Father Wilhelm accompanied him, offering final prayers and the chance for repentance. Schmidt remained silent. The execution procedure for breaking wheel was brutal but specific. The condemned was bound to a large wooden wheel lying on their back. The executioner then used a heavy iron bar to systematically break the major bones, legs, arms, ribs, while the victim remained conscious. The wheel was then hoisted upright and left standing, the broken body displayed to the public as a warning. Death came slowly from shock and exposure, but Strasbourg's magistrates had decided on a modification. Given the nature of Schmidt's crimes, and as a small mercy, the executioner would deliver a killing blow to the chest after breaking the limbs, hastening death. The executioner was a man named Rudolf Stern, a professional who had carried out numerous sentences. He approached his task with grim professionalism, aware that the entire city was watching. Schmidt was bound to the wheel. The crowd fell silent. Stern raised the iron bar. Before he brought it down, Schmidt spoke his last words, loud enough for those nearest the platform to hear. "My devices were art. They will endure when my name is forgotten." The bar fell. The first bone broke with a sound like a branch snapping. Schmidt screamed finally, a human reaction, a recognition of agony. The bar fell again and again. The systematic destruction took 12 minutes. Then Stern delivered the final blow to the sternum, crushing Schmidt's chest and heart. The screaming stopped. The body was left on display for 3 days, as was customary. Then it was taken down, burned, and the ashes scattered in the Rhine. No grave, no memorial, no marker that Hans Schmidt had ever existed. In the weeks following Schmidt's execution, Strasbourg's authorities faced difficult questions. What should be done with his workshop, with his devices, with his detailed notebooks that contained such precise engineering specifications? The workshop on Schwarzgasse was seized by the city. A priest blessed the building, but no one wanted to occupy it. Within 6 months, it was torn down completely. The land remained empty for over a decade before someone finally built new structures there. Schmidt's personal devices, those found in his workshop that had been used for his experiments, were destroyed publicly in a bonfire in the Rossmarkt. The flames burned for hours, fed by wood and pitch, reducing the instruments to slag and ash, but the devices he had sold. The racks and thumbscrews and iron boots currently in use across the German territories and beyond. Those remained. Magistrate Brandt proposed recalling them, destroying every instrument Schmidt had created, but the proposal was rejected. Too expensive, too impractical, and besides, the devices themselves were not evil, only the man who made them. Or so the reasoning went. Schmidt's notebooks posed a different problem. They contained engineering knowledge, precise specifications that could not be found elsewhere. Some magistrates wanted them destroyed. Others argued for preservation, not for use, but for understanding. The debate continued for months. Eventually, a compromise was reached. The notebooks were sealed and placed in the cathedral archives, with instructions that they were never to be opened except by order of the archbishop himself. They remained there, gathering dust, for over 3 centuries until a fire in 1778 destroyed that section of the archives. Whether this was accidental or deliberate arson, no one could say. The families of Schmidt's victims received official recognition from the city and small financial compensation, though no amount of money could restore their loss. Peter Halser, the young man who survived and testified, lived for another 6 years before dying of complications from his injuries. He never fully recovered, physically or mentally, from his ordeal. Kaspar Müller's parents, the wool merchant and his wife, became reclusive after learning their son's fate. They sold their business and moved to a village outside the city, unable to bear the memories that haunted Strasbourg's streets. Maria Kessler's family, she had 3 younger siblings and an aging mother, struggled financially after her death. She had been the primary income earner. The city's compensation helped, but poverty is tenacious. Within a generation, the family name disappeared from city records. The other victims, those Schmidt mentioned in his confession, but whose identities were never confirmed, remained unknown. Somewhere, families continued wondering what had happened to their missing children, never receiving even the terrible closure that the identified victims' families received. Schmidt's case sent ripples through the German territories. For the first time, authorities began questioning the ethics of torture device creation. If a craftsman could become so morally corrupted by building these instruments, what did that suggest about their use? Some cities began requiring that torture device manufacturers be closely monitored. Others insisted that such devices only be created within official facilities, not in private workshops. The Blacksmiths' Guild in Strasbourg added new regulations prohibiting members from accepting commissions for torture devices without explicit city approval. But these reforms were minor and short-lived. The fundamental practice continued. Torture remained legal and common throughout Europe for another 2 centuries. The instruments that Schmidt and countless others created continued to be used in the pursuit of confessions, real or false. The difference was simply that after Schmidt, craftsmen were more discreet. They didn't maintain detailed experimental notebooks. They didn't test their devices on kidnapped victims. They simply created what was commissioned and asked no questions about how it would be used or on whom. Perhaps that made them better people than Schmidt, or perhaps it simply made them better at hiding their complicity. Schmidt's final words proved both true and false. His devices did endure. Many torture instruments based on his designs were used for decades after his death. But his name did not survive. Within 50 years, he was referred to only as the blacksmith of Schwarzgasse, or the Devil's Hammer. His given name appeared in official records, but faded from common memory. This erasure was deliberate. The city wanted to forget. The guild wanted to forget. The church wanted to forget. Better to treat Schmidt as an aberration, a singular monster, than to examine the systems that had enabled him. But Friedrich Halsmann, the guild inspector who had visited Schmidt's workshop years before his arrest, wrote in his private memoir, completed shortly before his death in 1502, "We call Hans Schmidt a monster, and perhaps he was, but monsters do not emerge from nothing. They are created by the world around them. We created a world where instruments of agony could be commissioned, legally, where causing pain was considered essential to justice, where suffering was measured and monetized. Schmidt simply took our logic to its natural conclusion. We built the workshop. He merely worked within it." The story of Hans Schmidt remains a disturbing reminder that evil does not always arrive in the form we expect. It comes not only through passion and madness, but sometimes through cold calculation and entrepreneurial ambition. It emerges not despite civilization, but sometimes because of it, in the spaces where legal authority, moral emptiness, and economic incentive align. But questions remain that haunt us across the centuries. How many others like Schmidt existed, craftsmen who saw human suffering as merely another commodity? How many torture devices were tested, in similar ways but never discovered? The historical record is silent on these questions, and perhaps that silence is itself an answer. We do not know because we chose not to look. Schmidt's workshop is gone, his devices destroyed or lost to time, his name deliberately erased from memory. But the impulse he represents, the willingness to inflict suffering for profit, to treat human beings as disposable materials in pursuit of excellence, that impulse did not die with him on the breaking wheel in 1483. To this day, if you walk through the Krutenau quarter of Strasbourg, now a charming district of restaurants and galleries, you can find Schwarzgasse, though it's been renamed Rue du Travail, Street of Work. The buildings are new, none dating before the 18th century. There's no plaque, no memorial, nothing to indicate what once occurred there. But locals still avoid the spot where Schmidt's workshop stood. They build around it. The empty lot remains, used now as a small garden, and people say that nothing grows there quite as well as it should. Superstition, perhaps, or perhaps the earth itself remembers. And on cold autumn nights, when fog rolls off the Rhine and shrouds the old quarter in gray dampness, some people still report hearing sounds from that empty lot. The ring of hammer on anvil, the screech of metal against metal, the testing of mechanisms that should no longer exist. Imagination, surely, the mind playing tricks, but the reports persist, generation after generation, as if some echoes are too terrible to fade completely. If this journey through one of history's darkest examples of moral vacancy resonated with you, if you find yourself pondering how easily we can become complicit in systems of suffering when we normalize them as necessary, then consider subscribing to this channel. There are many more stories waiting to be told, mysteries buried in time that deserve to be examined not for entertainment, but for the uncomfortable truths they reveal about human nature and the societies we build. Leave a like if this account provoked reflections that go beyond mere historical curiosity, and comment sharing your thoughts on how we recognize and resist the normalization of cruelty in our own time. How do we ensure that the pursuit of efficiency, profit, or even justice does not lead us down paths where human dignity becomes just another variable in an equation? Until next time, remember that the past is not merely prologue. It is warning. The monsters of history wear many faces, and sometimes those faces are utterly ordinary until we look closely enough to see what lies beneath. This has been the Untold Hour,